Today's Comtech photography lesson will be on depth of field. So, depth. We care about depth because photography is a 2D medium, and we live in a 3D world. Because photography is two-dimensional, we need to figure out ways to show some depth that actually exists in real life in the scene. So this is the challenge that we come across in engineering quite a bit when we do design with CAD work or 2D drafting. This happens in art, trying to show some depth in a 2D medium, and photography here is what we're going to be talking about. You can create depth in a photo by including objects in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. So here we have some sheep, and you can see hills all the way into the background. Depth of field is what we care about today and is the main thing in photography as far as composition goes. The depth of field that you select when taking an image will drastically impact the composition of an image. You can isolate a subject from its background or foreground, or you can include everything as an artistic decision. We're used to taking pictures on our phones nowadays, and that's what we do in Comtech. But if you were to use a DSLR or a more high-end camera that you can actually control all the aspects to it, how do we change our depth of field? Well, in the camera, in the lens, there's something called an aperture. And that aperture opens to allow light into the lens and onto the film or onto the digital sensor. Think of it like your pupil. When it's really bright out, your pupil's smaller. When it's really dark, your pupil's larger. Same sort of deal. So we can control the aperture size to allow different amounts of light in. And that affects how blurry the background is. So if you don't allow much light in with a very small aperture, you have a large depth of field because nothing's blurry. If you have a larger, wider aperture, you let in more light, and then the background would be blurry. So what does this look like? Well, large depth of field. Usually great for landscape photos. All parts of the image appear sharp. There's usually no need to isolate elements by utilizing the depth of field in the landscape photos. So here, we want to show everything. This is a large landscape. We can show depth because we all know what this is like. We've all stood in a field and looked out and seen that depth, right? So we have some hay bales, the sky, and the field. All these images that are coming up have been taken on a phone, iPhone, but all modern phones have good enough cameras to take really good landscape photos. So here, in the front, it's in focus, and in the background, it's in focus. This is High Ridge in Westminster. Again, you have a tree that's in focus out into a pond, and then on the opposite bank, those trees are still relatively in focus. You can see them, so it shows that depth. Again, with this one, it's less in focus because of the conditions. It was foggy, it was the morning, but everything is visible. Here, we have someone in the foreground, in focus, and into the background. This was up top of a mountain going into a big valley where there was a large neighborhood. And even here, you can see some details on those houses, not as in detail as the subject, but we had a long, large depth of field here to show everything, including those mountains in the background. On the opposite side of that is the shallow depth of field. Here we isolate the subject up at the front of the image, and we don't care about the background, so we make it blurry. On a manual camera, you could change the aperture. On your phone, you can use portrait mode. And that's what portrait mode is. Portrait mode just makes a shallow depth of field. It does it in a more digital way, using some software, but it gets the same effect. So these images were taken on iPhone, particularly with portrait mode. But you don't need an iPhone. Androids now have portrait modes. And if you don't have that option, you can actually kind of make it work. And I'll show you that in person if that's the case. Here, the rocks right up front is in focus. The background is not. We have a shallow depth of field. Same with this. It's a handle that was put into a tree. The tree started to overgrow on it. And in the background, nothing. Here, these are some VEX blocks that we have from a competition in engineering. All three of them are identical, but you can see how in the background it gets blurrier compared to the one that's in focus up front because of that shallow depth of field. And why not try out both with the same subject? Here was a plant. On the right, we have a larger depth of field. We can see that flower with some leaves and also the background. And in this one, we just isolate that flower and the plant up front with a shallow depth of field. Okay, so when you're taking photography, especially depth of field photography and landscape photography, there's some things to watch out for. First one, when composing a photograph, one should observe the edges of the frame and look for elements that might be distracting and steal attention from the subject itself. So here, the subject is the cat. That's self-explanatory. But if you look on the photo on the left, to the upper right of the photo on the left, well, there are legs of a chair or a stool, something like that. And on the right, those were digitally removed just to show the difference. The photo on the right looks better because it isolates the cat and there's no distraction. Backgrounds. You don't want your subject to disappear into the background. So here, the woman was wearing a black shirt on a black background and kind of disappeared. It looked like a floating head playing the violin. If you wanted to do that for artistic reasons, great. If you don't want to, if you want to show who your subject is and show them in their entirety, then you want to make sure that there's a separation between the subject and the background. Also, sometimes you have objects behind your subject and they merge into them. Right here we have a cloud merging into this building. Is the background needed or not? If you're taking this photo, could you just shift what you're taking a photo of to really focus on this brick? Maybe you want to include the background. There's two ways to deal with it: include it or simplify it. So you get to make that decision. These are kissing edges. So here on the left, the background, this looks like the ocean. So the horizon line here hits the top of this girl's head. Over here, I mean, this was moved digitally as an example, but you would move the camera so that horizon line does not intersect with the top of her head. Just looks a little bit better. It's a better distinction between the subject and the background. So always pay attention to the background of the photograph subject. Questions you should ask yourself when you're taking the picture. Does the subject merge with the background? Is the contrast between the background and the subject strong enough for the subject to stand out? Does the subject look good on the chosen background? Here's some things to try as you start to take some pictures. Unusual viewing angle. Lay down on the ground. Take a photo from there. Stand up on top of a ladder. Take a photo from there. Try different angles that you wouldn't normally be in, you wouldn't normally see a subject from, to take some of your photos. Here's something, this is called a looking direction. There's a subject, there's a gazebo in this photo. In the background, both are in focus, not a shallow depth of field. But we as a viewer will look to where the person in the photo is looking. The person sitting on the edge of the pool is looking to the right and therefore leads the viewer's eyes in that direction. It's easy for the viewer to identify with the situation and to look at the building, at this gazebo. So here, this person's sitting at the edge of the pool. They are looking at the gazebo. We see that where they're looking, so we look at the gazebo as well. So today's goal, you are going to take depth of field photos. You want to take shallow and large depth of field. So if you have portrait mode, fantastic. If not, when you're taking a photo, you can tap on your screen to focus on one area, and that'll make the background blur out a little bit. That'll help. Large depth of field, you just take that photo of a landscape or a long room, something like that, that shows detail in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. You want to continue to use rule of thirds and lines. If you find lines, like one of these photos way back there at High Ridge, there was a road that had some lines in it and also had a large depth of field. You want to take a minimum of 10 photos for depth. Shoot for 5 and 5, right? You can take more than that. If you have one subject and you want to take large depth of field and shallow depth of field of the same subject, try to shoot for 10 different subjects, right? If you have any questions, let me know. Today's lesson is on depth of field.